Good day to you all. This is Juan Gutierrez, and this is a recording for SBS 300 fall semester of 2018. We're going to talk today about Anthony Giddens and Pierre Bourdieu, two of the most influential sociologists and social theorists of the late 20th century, early 21st century. And what I'm going to do today is I'm going to break the lecture into two smaller sections so that it's more digestible for you all. And the first one, I'm going to be talking about Anthony Giddens and his theory of restructuration. And then on the second clip, I'm going to be talking about Pierre Bourdieu and his theory of habitus and social capital, social and cultural capital. Right, let's get started with Sir Anthony Giddens, a British theorist that will be introduced to our attention next week in detail by your peers, but this is just a general introduction. Okay. So, as many of the most recent theories that we have been exploring, they, of course, the way of thinking and talking about society is deeply rooted in classical traditions. In the case of Anthony Giddens, we need to look at the three most influential of the classical theorists that we have explored this semester, which will be Karl Marx, the guy with the white beard here, Mr. Émile Durkheim, a French sociologist that you are all familiar with, and then Max Weber and his really interesting propositions on society and capitalism. Those are the classical traditions that Anthony Giddens is basing his perspectives fundamentally on. So he first explores what is the consensus, that is the prevailing paradigms that are present in the second half of the 20th century in terms of understanding society. And the one thing that is happening is after a long-standing reign of functionalism as the prevailing metaphor to understand society, multiple authors have been questioning whether or not this is a correct framework of understanding. I want to remind you that functionalism ultimately is a social theory that sees the role of the individual very much so framed and determined by the positionality of this individual within the specific institutions or arenas of action in the society he or she lives in. In other words, tends to see the individual as just a not too critical element in the functioning of society. Its rules, is the law, is some structural elements, the ones that are critically important. And so for many, starting as we also explored already, like Talcott Parsons, for many, then the individual was displaced into a corner that was not real or helpful in terms of understanding how society works. So there's a sense that the individual needs to be brought to the foreground, and then that becomes like a swinging rod that goes from one extreme to the other, and then on the other extreme is everything is determined by the individual. So there's really an existing discomfort with prevailing paradigms of the 20th century that both Anthony Giddens and also Bourdieu are trying to critically review and surpass with an alternative explanation. So the big question that they ask is how is it that society is ordered? Is this the individual that generates everything that we, as in the methodology will say, we negotiate? Social action is negotiated, and social meaning is constantly negotiated and renegotiated by individuals, or is this larger forces that are actually explaining individuals' behaviors? That's a big question that he wants to address. He identifies, and this is a very important point for me to make and for you to remember, these concepts as critical to understand society. Meaning, the meaning of social action, of individual action, of course action, power, and structure. So he brings into the fray both action and structure, both the individual and the collective. I take out something you want to remember from Giddens, and something that if I was asking you in an exam something about Giddens, this is what I would ask you. What is the meaning of this idea of the duality of the structure? So for Giddens, the structure is there, but not necessarily as autonomous or independent from the individual, but it's deeply interconnected. But the structure is real, and the structure is mostly for Giddens comprised of rules and resources. Rules and resources. Think of this university. So the university in and of itself is something somewhat untangible. We don't see a university. We see buildings, we see individuals, we see roads, buildings, and all of those resources and all of those rules of use of those resources and rules of interaction with each other. Those rules are actually the whole of what we call the university, which is the structural context in which you and I are working together this morning. Now, the duality of the structure, I would say it's to be remembering because of two things. One, structure will constrain what you can do, right? So I have to teach a class at a certain time of the day or certain days, and I need to be here. Those are the rules. I'm expected, and it's my function to be here. So it constrains what I do in visible, real ways. But on the other hand, it also enables me to challenge ways of doing things. So if one day I make a decision to try and bring flexibility to this course by means of an online presentation and using the infrastructure that we have for information distribution and platforms that we have, online platforms, then somehow I'm being enabled by the structure and the resources and the rules that are there to do that. And maybe in a way that will eventually create a major change in the pedagogical ways of this university. So as you can see, I am constrained, but I'm also enabled. Let's go. But the duality of the structure is also referring to the fact that it is comprised not just of rules or resources, but of the agency of the individuals that use and live and are constrained and enabled by those rules and resources. So what is agency? Another definition you have to remember, you have to memorize, you have to learn, you have to know. It's agency, according to Giddens, is the capacity of an entity, so it can be an individual or a group of individuals, to produce uncertainty and to make a difference. That's an interesting definition. The capacity of an entity to produce uncertainty and to make a difference. So it's not mechanical. It's not something that is just repeated exactly as the rules have determined activity. As a machine will repeat the activity because that's what we design the machines to do. No, agency can be disruptive, can generate uncertainty, and then in doing so, it disrupts the system and makes a difference. The disruption can be very negative, and it can be, as it always and mostly is, not always, but mostly, it can make a positive difference in terms of enabling the system to go to a different place. So, in terms of other concerns that Giddens expresses in his theory, he wants to know more about the nature of the industrial and capitalist society that we live in. he questions the very conception of modernity. That is, he should be considered a postmodern theorist, and he explores what modernity actually was. And as we mentioned the other day, postmodernity is more a state of transition than something in and of itself. We haven't just yet determined what's the nature of what we've been doing. But the one thing that we all know is that postmodernity will be any theoretical construction that questions and separates from the views that were advanced in the era of modernity. He's deeply very interested in this idea of the contingency of the nation states, because of the forces of globalization that, despite the backlash and the reactionaries' views against global forces are here to stay, and we live in a globalized social universe. So he is one of the first theorists that will really deeply engage in this conversation about what the global is. So if you're interested in globalization, then Giddens is definitely a reference that you want to use in your work. And then he was also very interested and keenly invested in talking about politics. And I don't know if you know this, but he was good friends with Tony Blair. And Tony Blair followed most of his views about the third way. He wrote a very famous book that is called The Third Way. So I was trying to figure out if there's an alternative between conservative politics and liberal politics, and he talked about the third way. Something that I'm not seeing today. I can see our society to be highly polarized, and I'm not seeing those third ways. But if you're interested in exploring how he framed that, then you can start Googling A Third Way by Giddens, and hopefully reading his book, which is a very comprehensive and interesting presentation. Okay, so now I'd like to spend the next few minutes, I'm trying to keep this presentation down to 20, just bringing to your attention a few key elements of restructuration theory. Most of the information that I have here has come from different sources. This particular outline I found quite useful and came from the Encyclopedia Britannica, quite well put together, just so that you know my sources. Okay, so let's start by exploring this definition of social structure, because to understand restructuration theory, we need to understand what is the structure, right? So first thing he says is the outcome of past practices. This university exists as it is because of what's been done in the past, because of the way that it was created, the context in which it was created, and then practices that have been transforming that original structure that was first put in place in 1994. So we've been doing things to the university in our practices that have resulted in what we have today. At the same time, the structure makes practices possible. That is, the structure is created by those practices, but also enables those practices. So structure is not separated from action. That's the duality of structure that I was talking about. Positivism, one of these paradigms of social science that we are becoming familiar with, positivism makes a mistake of searching for general laws in social life, as if the laws are independent from the individual and the individual action. And what he is proposing is that instead human beings are thoughtful and creative, and in being so, they cannot fully predict it in advance. So we are not just internalizing values, behaviors, and routines and then act on those routines, but we can actually act in a thoughtful and creative manner. So we bear ethical responsibility over our activities. Of course, many of the things that we do are framed in that structure, pre-existing structure, but we get to actually transform that structure. The fact that there are so many of you that are female students watching this video has to do with the fact that we are not just repeating behaviors, otherwise there would be only men in this classroom. But something has happened in this society that transformed that, and that is a practice that was both originally constrained by the structure, but then it was enabled by the structure. So I can give you multiple examples of the duality of the structure, and you can start thinking about those options. Goffman rings a bell to you because we have explored Goffman, and what Giddens does is he will rely on Goffman to document how individuals have always some form of agency that is capable of transforming a situation. And I was thinking, yeah, even slaves used to have power in the Roman times, just like undocumented immigrants have power, in that they can walk out of the places and then just show in their absence their irrelevance, and then make it evident that there's an ideological fight against groups of people that should be probably treated differently. I'm positive that whether or not you are on one spectrum or the other of the political life of this nation, we will look back at this day and age, and we will reconsider the treatment that was given to immigrants as similar or comparable to the treatment that was given in other civilizations to different more vulnerable groups of individuals. Just like the Greek would say, yeah, we're a democracy, but women are not to be considered as part of the democracy. Only those who own land and own property, that is male. So I think it's no different. Maybe it's controversial for me to say that right now, but if you look at history, I think that's what we're gonna be. So individuals, no matter what their location in the spectrum of the society is, we all have power in different ways. The practices that we live by are not fixed, and they change, and they can change, and they change through time. Clearly, that's part of what it is. So this sets the grounds for his theory. So structure is there, and it frames the behavior of individuals, but the behavior of individuals is not only framed as constrained, but is enabled. So individuals can change the society. And in this interplay between structure and agency is that society is transformed through time. Remember Marx, how he was concerned with change, and he was explaining change in terms of large social forces, meaning social classes. For Giddens, the difference, even as he is solidly grounded in Marxian thought, he sees that the presence of agency was not clearly understood by Marx, and he's bringing that in to bring to a fuller understanding how societies transform themselves, right? Actors use knowledge to engage in practical action. Societies then consciously reproduce or transform in every social encounter, which should ring a bell because we studied ethnomethodology. Every social encounter is a negotiation, so that's fine, Giddens says. But let's not forget the structure that surrounds that negotiation. So in that sense, he says human agency is bounded by the structural constraints, and that's also another definite. The constitution of society is a skilled accomplishment of its members, and one that doesn't take place under conditions that are wholly unintended or wholly comprehended by them. So people will make society with resources and practices inherited from the past, but people will make society. Structure then is based on this. We consider it's not something foreign to the individual, independent from the individual. It's a continuum, and actually the difference that we make between the individual and the structures is mostly, I would think, an analytical consideration, because it's just sort of a pond of merged and mixed things, but we need to separate those two to really understand how the life in that pond happens, right? So agency structure is part of the same continuum. Most of our practices, Giddens would state, take place at the level of practical consciousness. So we are responsible for the things that we do. We just act without thinking about it, and here's a point of connection between Giddens and Bourdieu. Bourdieu, as we will see in a few minutes, talks about habitus, that is the knowing what to do in any given moment. Think of a football game. When every play starts and every play lasts for a few seconds, every player has been training for so long to do exactly what they have to do. They don't have time to think about what they're going to do, they just do it. And that is the habitus, the knowing the rules. A player that is trying to catch a ball that was thrown at him, that player will not remember, but will try to keep his feet on the ground before leaving the field, or else the point wouldn't count. They don't think about it, they just do it because they've been training for so long. So the practices that we engage in society are very much so like that. We have been training for so long that we just act without thinking about it, and but then we can reach a level of discursive consciousness, which is when we think about what we have done. But when we're doing it, we just do it. Another points that I would like to bring from what Giddens will be saying about agency and structure is this idea of mutual knowledge, just how we interact. Is that taken for granted knowledge about how to act, and that is based on rules about the right and wrong way to do things. So just like the players in the football game will know what to do at every moment, we actually know that when we act in different social spaces that we live in. You know what are the rules that apply, because we've been trained to be students, to be instructors for a long time, and we know what rules are in place. We know what to do when we walk into a classroom. We don't need to be reminded. But then we can sit down for a moment and reconsider that mutual knowledge of that interaction and challenge that one and try to revert and change that in ways that are positive, that will make the structure more sustainable and more vibrant and more responsive to what we want at that moment in time. And so the agent has great capacity to carry on the practices and to, in doing so, transform the society, the structure they live in. So we have both status, going back to Max Weber, and we have resources. That is the two kinds of resources that we use when we navigate the structures. Authoritative resources and allocative resources, that is money and things. Social institutions like the family are indeed routinized practices, and that's another example that he explores quite a bit, how the different institutions work. A social institution only exists because several individuals constantly make it over and over again. This is a really important insight from Giddens. The institutions that we see so concrete and so real actually depend on our decision, everyday life decision, to continue engaged in that practice. There are institutions that just die because we make that decision to change our practice. An example here would be the value of the cab driver licenses in New York. Those licenses to have a cab in New York eventually came to be worth sometimes about $1 million to have a cab license, because we changed our ways of using the cabs, because there was a rebellion of people, of users, and that enabled other forms of transportation like Uber. And I have my mixed feelings, but it's the reality. Uber came in, and then as we stopped using the taxis the way we use, that reality that was valuable and valued in about 1 million is now worth pennies, and people are having a hard time, the cab drivers in New York, adjusting to this transition. So that is an example of an institutional element that was transformed because of the practice of individuals. And that example applies to everything we do. And to finalize my presentation, So let's be reminded, social structures do not reproduce. Oh, sorry about that. Okay, here we go. Social structures do not reproduce themselves. Agents and their practices are the ones that reproduce the structures. And that's a major departure from Marxist thought. The structure is simply made up of rules and resources. This is the most important, in my opinion, statement of clarification that was ever given by Giddens' theory. The structure is simply made up of rules that are in the heads of the agents, in the minds of the agents, and of resources. And those resources make action possible. Practices create and recreate rules and resources, and this is why structure only exists in practices and in the memory traces in agents' practical consciousness. So structure is not something independent from the individual, but is deeply interconnected. This is, my friends, the very interesting and nuanced understanding that Anthony Giddens will give us about the functioning of a social, of the society, of the social. All right, see you in a bit.